millions of people were allowed into the UK under Conservative leadership.
That is true. In the same way as the general public don't know what's going on, actually a lot of government ministers don't know what's going on. When you go to number 10, you only see things presented to you by the civil service. We have, in this country, empowered, unelected people. The police have been captured, ideologically captured. And the only way to change that is to make the police accountable. And the second thing you need to do is you need to make the judges accountable. Our culture is being undermined. Our civilization is being questioned. If I was Prime Minister,
yes,
I'd send the Navy into the English Channel and send the boats back. You could say that to the Ministry of Defence and they would say, well, it's not legal to do that.
And they just wouldn't send
And they wouldn't do it. And you can't sack them. The civil servants pull the levers rather than the ministers. That's what I learned. These people want to destroy our country. That's what we're facing.
Speak not to me of laws, my men have weapons.
I personally only found out about this when I was Prime Minister.
My name is Stefan Tompson. I'm the founder of Visegrad24, and today I'm in London in the United Kingdom with the former Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss.
Hi, hello.
Liz, start with a very basic question. What is it you want?
What I want is I want Western civilization to win, and I want all the threats to Western civilization to be vanquished. That's what I want.
If you were to identify the main threats, what do you think it is the West is facing? If you were to enumerate, say, the 3 to 5 largest threats one by one, what are they? So
China, I think, is the biggest threat. Islamism, wokeism, eco-fanaticism, Keynesianism. But what all of these things have in common is they are, maybe Keynesianism to a lesser extent, but they are all anti-Western civilization. That's what they've got in common. And there's a strong neo-Marxist element to what the left is now doing, which is trying to destroy the individual and the family, trying to destroy the nation state, and then instead replace it with a top-down Marxist system. That is the underlying goal. This is why people like Greta Thunberg, who was an environmental nutter, has now moved on to being pro-Hamas, because the same objective is there, but the people move on to the latest battlefield. And I think one of the big problems we've got is those of us on the conservative or the right or whatever you want to call it, haven't really understood the nature of that threat, and that it's an anti-civilizational threat. It's not just a traditional political debate.
What's very interesting about your answer is when you ask most conservatives about the threats to the West, the majority of what you said appears, with the exception of China, and you name it as the number one biggest threat. Can you tell me more about the CCP and why you think that the CCP is such a threat to us?
Well, I think if you look at what is the organisation that is capable of global power, at present, the US is still the global power.
Sure.
That is still the case. The dollar is the predominant currency.
Sure.
What is the alternative? It's not Iran, it's China. And I think China aids and abets the Islamists as a way of helping bring down Western civilization. But I think that's their explicit aim.
What can we do to counter the Chinese threat? Is the West even addressing China in a meaningful way? I mean, Trump.
Well, I think Trump is. I think Trump gets it, and he is. And if you look at what is behind the tariff strategy, the tariff strategy is taking on China. And he understood this from a long time ago. It was Bill Clinton that let China into the World Trade Organization, allowed China to trade on developing country terms. The Chinese economy is only the 10th the size of the US economy back in the 90s. And now it's rivaling the US. So we have allowed the fox into the hen house. That is basically what has happened over the last 30 years. And this is why I think it's such a threat. I think that other forces are aiding and abetting China, working with China. But I think at the bottom of it, the CCP is the most powerful force that we're up against.
What are some of the forces that are aligned with the CCP?
The Islamists, if you look at the
As in,
Iranians,
sort
the
of
Russians,
this axis of
the
Russia,
acts of
China, Iran.
Russia, China, North Korea, but also lots of Chinese funding is going into Western countries. People are compromised. They're compromised via various different routes. So, for example, in Britain, there's a bid at the moment for the Daily Telegraph.
Sure.
The chairman of the bid is closely connected with Xi Jinping. So you just see all of these elements are present. They're present. They're present in Western universities. They're present in the media. They're present in investment decisions. They've been very, very successfully infiltrating our societies. I'm not saying it's the only force, but I'm saying it's probably the most concerning force. I think
because it's
in
the
terms
strongest.
in terms of what there's a difference between China being the biggest global threat and Islamism being the biggest threat to Europe. So I would say that the immediate threat to Europe is Islamism, but China is ultimately the biggest global threat.
Let's talk about Islamism. I was going to ask you about immigration, but I suppose it's so tightly connected. There's been a massive change in the public debate over the last few years. The Overton window is really seriously shifting very fast. We're allowed to say things that most people really were thinking, but there was an embargo on being able to say them, partially because the mainstream media detained such a monopoly over narratives. Now that that's been sort of decentralized thanks to social media and Musk. Tell me about immigration. I mean, I
think also that the problems got worse. So I think, yes, you've had the rise of alternative media, which has meant that people are able to speak more freely.
Yes.
But you've also had a worsening of the problem. So those two things have gone together.
So tell me about the problem. And obviously it's interesting from the perspective of a former Conservative Prime Minister, because the Conservatives and Boriswave has certainly made the problem of migration worse in the UK. Millions of people were allowed into the UK under Conservative leadership.
That is true. That is true. So first of all, I think there's a long-term problem. And the most obvious example of this are the rape gangs that we've seen operating since the 1970s. This is how long this has been going on. Tens of thousands of girls have been raped, tortured, even murdered, and this has basically been covered up. And
what's the number of girls that you think?
Well, we don't know. We don't know. I was saying it's tens of thousands, but we don't know, because the Labour Party have now said there's going to be a national inquiry. It hasn't started yet. So, these figures are unknown. These crimes are still continuing. But what I'm saying is there's been a long-term problem in British society of these acts which have largely been committed by people of Pakistani origin. That has been covered up. So that is one massive problem. And certainly I am somebody who was not aware when I was in government of the extent of that problem. And, in the same way as the general public don't know what's going on, actually a lot of government ministers don't know what's going on. So this has been covered up from people in positions of power, as well as it's been covered up from the public. So I think that's one problem we've had as a country for a very long time, is a refusal to lift the bonnet on internal British problems that have resulted from immigration to our country. So that started because the next problem is Tony Blair. And I don't think we can underestimate how much damage the Blair government did to our country. If you look at the problems we've got with our justice system, Blair made the judiciary unaccountable with the Constitutional Reform Act. He created the Human Rights Act, which is the basis for all these people not being able to be deported. They're using the Human Rights Act. He created the legal and bureaucratic system that now makes it impossible for the government to act on illegal immigration. So I think the Blairite system is a major cause of the problem. And then you have the third problem, which is the Boriswave. Okay. So the Boriswave, when Brexit took place, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth by, the entire bureaucracy, the entire sort of business blob. All of those people were saying, this is terrible. People aren't going to come into our country. It's terrible. We won't have people to work in social services or whatever. We won't have people. So there was huge pressure at the time. At the same time, you also had COVID, which of course nobody was coming into the country. So the salary thresholds were set too low, far too low after Brexit. And students were allowed to bring dependents into the country. So you had a ludicrous situation where a student would be bringing 4 dependents in. This is what was going on. This is what insane. And I personally only found out about this when I was Prime Minister.
Students were allowed to bring dependents in.
Yes.
Why would students be allowed to bring dependents? What's the rationale behind that? You're coming to study, surely.
Well, the rationale.
Why do you have dependents?
I thought the policy was ludicrous, but I suppose. There are some PhD students, I don't know, but anyway, it was a ludicrous policy and it was being massively abused. And, you could go down the list of countries and you'd see, like Nigeria in particular, most students were coming with dependents, whereas that wasn't the case for students from Europe. So it was a system that was clearly being abused. The point I'm making is that at the time, the Home Office were estimating, and this was at the point I became Prime Minister in September 2022, the Home Office were estimating that net migration would be 200,000 that year. That's what the Office of Budget Responsibility were estimating. The figure actually turned out to be 1 million. So the whole system did not completely misestimated how much migration this would result in. Which is, so yes, there's a political failing. There's also a massive bureaucratic failing here of completely failing to understand what the impact of those changes to the migration system would be.
I think when people think of the political system and they think of people in government and the Prime Minister and ministers, they think of this sort of very powerful machine. I think one of the most interesting things you've said so far was about the fact that things were covered up from you and you only found out about it at a certain point. Can you explain in sort of layman's terms what it's like to sort of be at the highest position of power, and then obviously you have a limitation in resources, and that's your attention span, right? So you're being bombarded with a million things. Tell me about how information is kept away from people in power.
The way the British government is set up is the permanent civil service are there, and they can't be hired and fired by ministers. So whichever department you become Secretary of State for, you have a permanent secretary, and it is pretty difficult to move them on and replace them with somebody else. And if you want to replace them with somebody else, it's very hard to bring somebody in from outside. You generally have to replace them from another civil servant from another government department. And if you're in a job like I was DEFRA secretary, for example, back in 2014, and I was dealing with floods. So 24 hours a day, I was, worried about whether the flood barriers would hold, what we were doing to make sure that, we had to bring the army in at one point. The floods were so serious. So 24/7, you're just absorbed with whatever your portfolio is, partly because the system is so unresponsive and unaccountable that you have to, it's a 24/7 job. So what I'm saying is ministers in other departments don't necessarily know what's going on. It's all quite siloed. So
that makes
something
sense.
like the grooming gangs.
Sure.
I would not have been aware. I mean, maybe I might have seen a document pass through once in a blue moon.
Sure.
But there's not a system of government management information where everybody is told what's going on. you are there in your department. You are
Focused
generally,
on you're
you're
sort
very
of
focused, and
blindsided.
you're also battling 24/7
With
with
the
civil servants. Not to mention, I mean, DEFRA, for example, it's just an example, one department, but we were in so many legal disputes. We were being sued by climate change activists about air pollution. We were being sued by the Badger Trust about the badger cull. But this is like, so you're kind of constantly firefighting all these battles, a lot of which, and this is why I go back to the Blair government, a lot of those battles were resulting from legislation passed by the Blair government. I mean, of course, the answer is the Conservative Party ought to have repealed those on day one in 2010. We should have repealed all that stuff because it made our lives so hard because we were constantly battling a system that was essentially rigged against us. So I did, I was in 6 different departments. I did, a number of different roles. You end up being very, very focused on what needs to be done. As Foreign Secretary, we had the war break out in Ukraine. That was, again, a sort of 24/7 operation. So really, it's only when you get to the position of Prime Minister, or actually it's also true in the Treasury. The Treasury have quite a good overview of what's going on in government. And I was Chief Secretary for 2 years, so I did see where all the money was being spent. And I saw, that's also where I learned the Treasury was the most powerful department in government. And I learned how they pull the levers, how the civil servants pull the levers rather than the ministers. That's what I learned from my time in the Treasury. But when you go to number 10, when you're elected as Prime Minister, you only see things presented to you by the civil service unless you explicitly ask for stuff. So the reason that I got the migration data is I asked for it from the Home Office. But that is, if you think about it, if you have to initiate everything, and of course a cabinet minister can bring things to your attention, you don't necessarily have the overview of what's going on. So, and you don't, because the people working for you aren't people you've appointed, they're the system. They obviously have their own interests in what gets presented.
So you get all these conspiracy theories that there's some sort of cabal of dark people running things, sort of the billionaire class, sort of puppeteering the ministers. What you're saying is that essentially the people pulling the puppet strings are actually the civil servants. Is that the conspiracy theory?
It's not a conspiracy. It's a, and this is why I think it's, the word blob is a very useful phrase. And can
you explain the blob to people who aren't necessarily...
So what the blob is a lot of this is groupthink. So I think some of the things that happened were deliberate sabotage. And I would accuse the Bank of England of my policies. So I would accuse the Bank of England of deliberate sabotage. Okay. But most of it is just blob-like thinking, that everybody in the blob has a similar worldview. So they all believe in net zero legislation. They all believe that Britain needs higher migration to deal with our demographic problems and our economic problems. They all believe that big government is a good thing. There's just a set of assumptions that everybody in the government, in the civil service, fundamentally believe. And that's what makes it a blob. And they share those views with the BBC, with Sky News, with the senior people in the City of London, the Bank of England. It's a shared worldview of the British elite. And the British elite is heavily influenced by the American elite, the European elite. These are people that were very, very upset with the Brexit decision because it was antithetical to their worldview. And they've spent years and years sort of coming in and out of international institutions. Take the head of the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is now a very powerful body responsible for deciding Britain's fiscal forecast and essentially deciding tax policy. This man was formerly at the Resolution Foundation, a left-wing think tank. He was at the IMF. I think he even worked for the French Finance Ministry. He worked for the Treasury. So these people kind of circulate in these jobs. they have a particular worldview, and they present everything to ministers through the prism of that worldview. That's what it's like. So when you're in government, it's almost like being in a sort of ideological prison.
Wow.
And I have a different ideology. So I spent a lot of my time fighting back against this, arguing this, saying that these numbers are wrong, talking from first principles and challenging the civil servants. Yeah. And I'm not saying every civil servant is a sign-up Marxist. I'm just saying that's the culture. There's they're pro-transgender activism, they're pro-Stonewall. All of that kind of thing is there. So when you are trying to do policies that go against the grain, you get a lot of resistance and pushback. If you want to do things like gender self-ID or more climate change action, then they're rushing to help. So that's what it's like being in that system. And I think people who haven't worked in government don't understand quite how all-consuming it is, because also you're very restricted in who you can speak to outside. And if you're speaking...
What does that mean?
What I mean is everybody you meet, has to be, documented and written down. If you meet somebody from the private sector, you'll be accused of them lobbying you, or, they have undue influence on you. You can't use figures that aren't produced by the official civil service. So some people said to me, oh, Liz, you should have got an economic forecast from outside. You can't. It's the law that you have to use the official figures produced by the Treasury or the Office of Budget Responsibility. So it's a very constraining environment.
How did you come to have... I mean, you're presented by the mainstream media as quite a radical at this point. You have some pretty...
I've been radicalized. I actually didn't... This is the thing. I didn't start off. When I was... got into government, I was a junior minister. I've been a minister for 10 years. Sure. I'm sorry, 12 years actually. But I didn't start off as a sort of, you got to break the system. I started off believing that you could change the system from within. And that's, I took my point of view and I thought I could get the system to do what I wanted them to do as an elected minister. And at first I thought it was just because I was too junior in the system to actually have an impact. So I thought, fair enough, I'm a junior minister at education. This is why I'm not able to do it. I've been overruled by Nick Clegg, or I've been overruled by David Cameron. Fair enough. But then as I rose through the ranks, I noticed that was still the case. And yeah.
So what would you say are some of the things what would sort of, give me a few examples of things that radicalized you within the system?
So the thing that radicalized, the first big thing that radicalized me was when I became Lord Chancellor. Mm-hmm. And this was in 2016. And I saw the way the senior judiciary behaved, and they were completely unaccountable. They were, when I tried to challenge the appointments they were making, and this, remember, Tony Blair had changed the whole system. So it used to be the case that the Lord Chancellor would appoint the senior judges, and they would sit in the House of Lords as the Speaker. They would be in the cabinet. They were appointed by the Prime Minister. What Blair did, he took all that away. He gave the job to the Judicial Appointments Commission and the Lord Chief Justice, none of whom were appointed by elected government ministers. And when I started to challenge the judiciary, they just went for me. There was a smear.
What does that mean?
Well, just a smear.
Went for you.
Well, they had they briefed the press that I was, that I was failing to stand up for the independent, judicial system. They questioned my everything from my intelligence to my ethics. They went for me, and it was they went for me publicly. The Lord Chief Justice did a session in the House of Lords criticising me. They briefed the press. There were quite a lot of lawyers in the Conservative Party. They'd be busy sort of talking about, it was just constant. And ultimately, I got removed from the job because I had taken them on. That's
Wow.
and that showed to me that we have in this country empowered unelected people, and they, through a combination of social pressure, media pressure, keep control, and they resist attempts by people who are elected to do a job to actually change. So I saw, and actually the behaviour that I then saw from the Treasury and the Bank of England was very, very similar to the tactics the judiciary had used. So I'd already been through the mill in terms of that, sort of smear. It's basically a smear campaign and trying to undermine somebody. And what I noticed is these people are in those jobs for life. If you're a senior judge, you've been in the judiciary for 30 years. You have all the contact details of all of the newspaper journalists, the mainstream media. You're giving them stories, you're leaking stuff to them. That makes you powerful compared to politicians who are here today, gone tomorrow.
You mentioned the grooming gangs several times. I feel like that's something that clearly has deeply impacted you. Does that radicalize you? The fact that it was hidden away from the public for several decades.
It's such a sickening and shocking. I think it was the first time I became aware of it was when the BBC actually did a documentary called Three Girls, and I thought this is like an appalling situation. But I believed at the time that had exposed the issue, and the Home Office were dealing with it, and the police were dealing with it. So when it was raised again particularly by Elon Musk, actually,
sure.
I think last year.
VCR24 played a big role in that. I'm actually very proud of the work that we did.
That's good to hear.
Redigging into the story is horrific.
But what was so shocking is that no action had really been taken, or very little action had been taken since 2017. And the fact that the police are complicit, the fact that police officers have actually been accused of being directly involved, that none of the councils were held to account. And I remember back in the 2022 Conservative Leadership Party elections, I was asked about this, and I said the thing that needs to happen is that people in authority who condoned this, who turned a blind eye, they need to be sacked from their jobs. They need to be held to account. They need to be prosecuted if necessary. That's what needs to happen. And that is what I thought needed to happen. And here we are in 2025, and it's still not happened. It's still not happened.
Why do you think that more people are not absolutely... I mean, there's one story that I go back to every time I have this conversation, especially with people from...
Please don't. I just find some of the details so shocking
without
and sickening.
Any of the details. It's
just
a story
shocking,
from
sickening.
Oldham in 2006. 12-year-old girl named Sophie goes into police station, says she's been molested. The police officers tell her, come back when you're sober. You're dealing with a 12. I mean, that that in of itself is radicalizing.
Yeah, I know.
She gets picked up by two
so
Pakistani
awful.
men.
Yeah.
Essentially, what happens is she encounters 3 groups of people later that night. All 3 of them rape her.
Yeah.
And I read that story. I've every single liberal I've spoken with, whenever this comes up, I Google the article and I say, look, just read this, and then. The scale of the grooming gangs, and there's a number of other things, obviously, that are radicalizing that are happening around the UK. The stabbing epidemic, two-tier justice, stagnation. There's a number of things, right? But the grooming gang scandal is something that should unite all people. Yeah. And yet, it would appear that you're one of the very few people in the political establishment who has genuinely been radicalized. I'm saying radicalized in brackets because, if anything, it's common sense to be shocked by this.
But these people that you raise it with, what are they saying?
No, they say it's horrible, but essentially it's in some ways it's like a response that Sadiq Khan gave when he was asked about terrorism, and he said it's part and parcel of living in a large city. I don't know.
Do people really say that though? I haven't heard people say that.
Not that it's part and parcel of living in a large city, but essentially sort of waving their arms. Not much that can be done about it. It's sort of reminiscent of Sadiq Khan essentially going.
I think the issue is that the solution to it is so big that frightens people, and it's the same.
And this is where.
So you need to make the police accountable. You need to make chief constables sackable and hireable, which would be a major change. Because what the police do at the moment is they hide behind operational independence.
Okay.
So they say, well, we're operationally independent. You know, we've got this independent college of policing. Mm-hmm. But the fact is the police have been captured. They've been ideologically captured. And you can see by the Graham Lineman arrest recently about, you know, his anti-transgender tweets or whatever they were, that, you know, the police are pursuing particular agenda that is not the agenda of the public. And the only way to change that is to make the police accountable. And they're not accountable. And the second thing you need to do is you need to make the judges accountable, which you have to get rid of all the Blairite stuff, the Supreme Court, the Judicial Appointments Commission, and you have to make the Lord Chancellor powerful again. Because I know from sitting in that job as Lord Chancellor is you don't have the levers. I mean, I was incredibly frustrated at the time about the way that rape victims were being treated and were being, you know, cross-examined in court. I wanted them to be able to give more video evidence. The judges were very resistant to it. And I had very little power to actually get stuff done. So what I know is that if you're sitting in jobs like the Home Secretary job or the Justice Secretary job, you do not have the power to change these things at the moment. We need to change the law to give those people the power. So that's why I'm saying that the answer is quite big to this question, because it requires a completely different way of running the government.
What's very interesting about your answer is that you're much more focused on, many Conservatives end up being focused on external enemies as opposed to the internal one, where it would appear that, for example, people who are frustrated with migration, be it legal or illegal, fundamentally it's not the fault of migrants that they're coming to Western countries. It's the fault of Western elites and Western establishment figures for enabling the policies that allow them to come. So it's very interesting that you pointed out both the policing and the judges, as opposed to saying, you know, the standard answer that I sort of would have semi-expected for you to say would have been, you know, we need to jail these people or deport them. You know,
that's obvious. That's obvious. Like,
but it hasn't been done, right? They're still here.
Yeah, like what I am interested in is why these things haven't been done when that's what the majority of the population want. And if you look at even politicians, and we know that politicians are more liberal than the public, and they're to the left of the public.
Yes.
And we know that the Westminster bubble is a bubble of kind of wokey leftiness. And everybody gets infected.
Yeah.
I think even the Reform MPs get infected by just being in Westminster. I think
Tell me more about
it's
this.
it's an infectious bubble.
Okay.
But even so, despite all that, you know, they are. If you look at what Conservative ministers did for the 14 years of Conservatives being in office, they pursued policies that were, to a significant extent, the pet projects of NGOs, the elite, rather than the public. So things like, you know, what Stonewall were lobbying for, or what the environmental NGOs were lobbying for.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that the mechanism where the public vote for politicians to do things and politicians then do them has completely broken down, because the pressure on politicians is coming from the Blob to do things, and then they're trying to justify that to the public, and that's where that's why I'm saying we've got a system problem here. We've not just got a problem of the wrong politicians are in office. We've got a problem that the system doesn't work.
Walk me through how you think the system can be reformed. Can it even? Well, I guess the real question is...
Of course it can.
Okay, right. So we agree
this
on
is
that.
a country that's had Cromwell. I mean, ultimately anything can be done, provided there are, 350 MPs prepared to vote for it.
There's a wonderful...
Ultimately anything can be done.
There's a wonderful quote by Pompey, which goes... Speak not to me of laws, my men have weapons. Which I've always found very, some very clever ex-account posted it in response to Trump's bombing of the Venezuelan drug dealers, and Rand Paul saying, "Oh, where was the due process?" And someone responded with that. I thought it was very clever. So walk me through.
Essentially, the laws that have been holding this country back and making our system impossible to govern need to be repealed. It's as simple as that.
There's a number of laws that end up being enacted which were evidence of the crimes happening rather than the crimes being pursued. And this is very reminiscent to what you see today. I was walking down Piccadilly Circus and there was that, that meme online that's become reality of there is a line, mind the grab.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen that? Right?
I've heard about it.
But the mind the grab, right, having it written on the
weird,
pavement isn't so much stopping the crime happening. It's merely highlighting the fact that it's real. Another wonderful one I saw, I was walking down into the tube and on the side of the wall there's this poster went, taking photos under women's dresses or skirts is a crime, right? Which is no person who's going to take the photograph. He's not going to look at the sign and go, okay, I'm not going to take that photo. That's just evidence of it happening. So the laws kind of that we have against pickpocketing, stabbings, sexual assault, there's a whole number of things. There is an epidemic of crime in the UK. I think it's one phone every 5 minutes being stolen in London right now. The fare dodgers, you see, obviously petty crime. But fundamentally, if it happens too often, eventually the system stops working because everyone's abusing it, and the cost of it all gets passed on to the few remaining people who still abide by the rules. There's a set of laws that is not being abided by, clearly, right? The fare dodging, the pickpocketing, and then you're telling me about the laws that are holding back the country. Are those the laws that are being abided by? Does the system abide by its own rules?
What these laws that I'm talking about, that have created the blobby state or whatever we're going to call it. They are making the authorities unaccountable. So they are more interested in what special interest groups want them to do than they are interested in what the public want them to do. So, for example, why are the police at Heathrow Airport arresting a comedian rather than dealing with pickpockets? The answer is because they are getting their leadership not from the public or indeed their political representatives. They're getting their leadership from the sort of woke culture of the day. So that's the problem. The law enforcement we're talking about, things like the Human Rights Act, whatever. Those are part of that ideological mindset. So yes, probably it is the case that some laws are more equal than others. That's probably true. Yeah, thinking about it. But we've just created this morass of law. I mean, we're over legislated. I mean, I think Britain has got a particular problem because we've got European bureaucracy coupled with American legal culture, which just makes it a sort of morass to get anything done. This is what I was saying about being a Secretary of State. I just was shocked by the number of court cases we were in and the number of times we were being sued, and a great fear of...
How much of your time was that consuming when you were Secretary of State?
Well, it depends which department you were in. I mean, a lot in DAFRA, the Environment Department. But the point is that civil servants are then worried about being sued when they're creating policy. So it has a chilling effect on being able to do things because And we have an independent government legal service with 2,000 lawyers in it. They are busy telling civil servants, you can't do this or you can't do this because it's against this law, or you might be sued by this, or you might be judicially reviewed, or there's a 50% chance that, this won't be able to go through. So it creates a constant effect on actually getting anything done.
As you were saying this, I was thinking of all the conversations I've had with conservative activists who sort of, there's a whole spiel, right? I mean, a lot of interviewers will ask people, what would you do were you in power? And it's very interesting to have the conversation with someone who's actually been in power and sort of actually talking you through all the things
because
that cannot be done.
People say things like...
Oh, they say, I'll fix it all tomorrow. Just give me political power.
People say things like, if I was Prime Minister,
yes,
I'd send the Navy into the English Channel and send the boats back.
Yes.
Well, if you did that, you could say that to the Ministry of Defence, and they would say, well, it's not legal to do that.
And they just wouldn't send.
And they wouldn't do it.
They wouldn't send.
And you can't sack them. So, it's.
Yeah.
The first priority of any government in the future has to be being able to govern.
So sending the Navy, because a lot of sort of you have this sort of this sort of current of quite macho, conservative or right wing or whatever you want to call them, content creators will say, it's just a matter of willpower. It's not, I'm assuming it requires more than willpower to send the Navy.
If you wanted to do that, you would have to change the law.
Or just break it.
But you can't break it because
the people... You can't break the law?
Well, you can't according to the ministerial code. You can't break the law.
So you would be stopped by the actual system.
But the civil servants would refuse to break the law.
Therefore
you couldn't even give the order.
What if the Secretary of Defence was on board? Could you send the boats then?
No, because you would have to have... the people who would actually be sending the boats would be the heads of the military, not the Defence Secretary.
And they would also have to be willing to break the law.
Yes, and they're not, because they're part of the Civil Service Code lays out that you can't. And who interprets what the law is? The Government Legal Service. So they say, so you might say, well, actually, I'm more focused on, the laws of Britain. This international law is something that I think we should be able to... International law is an interesting area. It's, you might say, well, I'm focused on laws of Britain, but this hasn't actually been passed by Parliament. They can say, well, sorry, we think this international law is important. This is what happened in the whole Chagos case, by the way. We believe this international law is the key law, and we're not going to let you break it. So this is what I'm saying, is you have to have a system where the people working for the Prime Minister are actually accountable to the Prime Minister and hire and fireable by the Prime Minister.
And the absurdity of international law, as it stands currently, is that there is a series of countries that play by international law and a whole other series of countries that just completely ignore it, which renders it... And
there are various...
Right?
Because I looked at all this for the Northern Ireland Protocol bill that we were planning to put through Parliament when I was Foreign Secretary. And there are various cases where, if it is damaging to your national interest, if it severely impacts your population, you are able to not follow the precise letter of the law. This is very clear. There's lots of cases of this. There's a Canadian case we looked at. So, there are many different legal interpretations of what you do on international law. The point is that you, the Prime Minister, or you, the Defence Secretary, or you, the Chancellor, are not the one deciding that.
We were talking about boats and stopping the boats in the Channel, which brings me to an interesting, to the sort of next place where I wanted the conversation to go, which is the issue of migration. I was at Tommy's March, and there were a number of speakers, and it was interesting because amongst them were some fairly mainstream politicians, including member of the European Parliament Dominic Tarczynski, who's a member of Law and Justice, Law and Justice is a centre-right political party in Poland, fairly mainstream by most standards. And Dominic, his speech was all about deporting illegals. And then there were a few other speakers, and amongst them was a young girl from the Netherlands called Eva Vladenbroek, who spoke about remigration. And her entire speech was actually mostly focused on legal migration. I wanted to ask you about your position on legal. Obviously, we're all against illegal immigration. That breaks the law to begin with. Mm-hmm. But most conservatives have a tendency to focus on the issues of illegal migration as opposed to legal one. And yet what we have seen, including the grooming gang scandal, I know we keep going back to it, the grooming gang scandal was fundamentally perpetrated by people who were here legally and their descendants.
Yes.
Walk me through your position on the difference between legal and illegal immigration and whether you think legal migration is an issue.
So legal migration is an issue and illegal is an issue. Illegal you have to deal with by repealing the Human Rights Act, by setting up a Rwanda-style scheme.
Okay.
We know what needs to be done on illegal migration.
Yes.
You need to be ready, on the coast. When people arrive, they immediately get deported. It's not. This is not rocket science. You need to deport them, and you need to have somewhere to go. But you need to change the law because otherwise, they will use human rights law to stay in the country. It's pretty obvious what needs to happen on illegal migration. On legal migration, I think we have to heavily restrict family migration. So this idea of chain immigration, where you can keep bringing in people from the same family, and this is what has perpetrated, the recreation of essentially villages in Pakistan, in parts of England.
And has that happened?
Yes.
That's like literally.
What is happening is people are being brought in. There's lots of cousin marriage,
of course,
going on.
It's a very serious problem in the Pakistani
it's
community.
perpetrating a culture which I think is completely antithetical to our way of life in Britain. So I think you've got to stop chain migration. You've got to stop all this ludicrous student-dependent stuff. I mean, I'm for heavily restricting student migration. I think it has become a short-term cash cow for universities. Sure. And I think that our universities should be primarily educating British students. I'm not against some overseas students who are here temporarily, but it's become a massive cash cow. It's also a problem, from the point of view of infiltration. And I'm particularly talking about China when I'm talking about infiltration. But those are the types of things we need to look at. I also think we should be looking at dual nationals.
Tell me more about that. I'm very interested in that. What does that mean?
Well, what I'm saying is, I think in Germany you can't be a dual national, and I think we should be looking at that for the UK. I'm very sceptical about the ability. Actually, I think you're a dual national, aren't you? Yeah,
more than
could
that.
Be a. you could be in the firing line, but these are the kind of things we really need to look at, because I think it is appalling that the culture that is antithetical to our way of life in Britain has been allowed to be perpetuated for generations.
Speaking of dual nationals and of legal migration,
are you a tri-national? Actually,
one of the greatest tragedies.
You got to choose. You got to choose. You'd have to choose. Correct.
You'd have to choose. It's actually.
Which would you choose?
I consider myself first and foremost a Pole. I am, I am first and foremost a Pole. I feel very strongly about my country. South Africa is such a complicated place because South Africa is, as you know, it's a rainbow nation. It's difficult to be attached to something that is so ill-defined. And actually, this is the very concerning aspect of what's happening in the United Kingdom, that you have a certain form of South Africanization. The larger the Pakistani community grows, the larger the Jamaican community grows, the Somali community grows. Fundamentally, multiculturalism is just groups of people who are, one culture living not with each other, but besides each other in little enclaves. And that's very concerning. But I was going to tell you about the Poles and legal migration. The mass migration of Poles in the early 2000s after the Poles joined the European Union was as great a tragedy for the British working class, because they obviously depreciated wages of plumbers, of cleaners, of all the people in working class jobs. A mass arrival of people willing to work for less and willing to live, several people in a room. Just a reality. But equally, it was a massive tragedy for Poland, because we suddenly let go of circa 2 million people in prime age that had been educated at the cost of the Polish taxpayer. Off they went, had children in the UK. These children now mostly, sadly, don't speak a single word of Polish. And we now, our demographic pyramid, there's a chunk of people missing there. So I kind of, whenever people tell me about, the sort of, obviously me being quite a staunch anti-immigration person, say, but my grandparents were refugees here and they were legally refugees here. But they sort of call out the hypocrisy of me being opposed to people. I'm not opposed in all cases, obviously, but there is a common sense approach that one can have. So I think there's two things.
Right? One is that the Refugee Convention was set up when we didn't have such easy travel.
Correct.
When people didn't have social media and could see, it is just not. It's not a realistic prospect in this day and age, and the whole concept of asylum it's a concept I don't think that works anymore.
I agree.
I think it's fundamentally a broken concept. Now, when I was Trade Secretary, I set up the youth travel scheme for young Australians and young Brits. I think it's good for people to be able to travel around the world. I think it's good for where you've got a country that is aligned, similar living standards. I think those types of schemes can work. Yeah. The problem is that the situation has gone so dramatically wrong that it's very difficult to separate what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think the absolute priority has to be to crack down. That is where we are now.
Deportations. That's become a term that used to be very taboo and very naughty. And Trump has sort of turned it completely mainstream, and Trump is actively pursuing deportations. Yes. Is this something that is possible, feasible in the UK?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, all of these things, I keep highlighting this point, all of things are possible provided you completely change the law and the governing system of Britain. So it's quite a big
if.
It's quite a big if, because at present, the level of executive power required to do that does not exist in the hands of the Home Secretary, and the laws would stop that from happening. So it's a big if.
Going back to the rally, which was interesting because it wasn't attended by anyone from the British mainstream. But I would say people are saying the press is talking about probably 100,000 people, which I think is an underestimate. Tommy and co are talking about 3 million people, which I think is an outrageous lie. I think the number is probably somewhere around 3, maybe 400,000 people attending. It was a well-attended event. It was very peaceful. Most of the interesting thing to me about the event was that most of these people were clearly very fed up with something. But I think if you were to walk into the crowd and ask them what it was they actually want, most of them felt quite directionless in a way, politically. What do you think is... You're a conservative with quite well-defined views and beliefs, and you've obviously thought about what you believe and why you believe it. One of the rare coherent things in that crowd was there was a sense of a desire to return to Christendom, which I thought was genuinely very interesting. That as radical Islam becomes more present, I went to the National Gallery yesterday, and right in front of it was a booth. Ask us anything about the Quran. And, four Muslim gentlemen, perfectly friendly people, by the way, but nonetheless, you're on Trafalgar Square and you're being told, you're being proselytized to by Muslims. Yeah. The more radical Islam has established itself in the UK, the stronger as atheism has transformed from, godlessness to essentially turning atheism into a god, the more I feel there's been a desire to return to the Christian roots of the UK. Tell me about your sort of views on ordering society and what you think of this sort of mass movement of people. And do you think this is this a one-off? Is this reflective in any way of what's happening in British society?
I think the Christian values point is important. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that there is a revival happening. Mm-hmm. And there's a revival amongst younger people. And people want Britain to be a Christian country. Mm-hmm. That's what they want. That is the... and we are a Christian country. We've got an established church, the Church of England. So that is that is what it is.
Yeah, it is.
And people are having to become more vocal about it because of the open Islamism that is taking place, including things like the Hamas marches and all that stuff. I think the march, the demonstration that took place, was it yesterday or Saturday?
It was on Saturday.
It shows that people in Britain, there is a growing body of people who are unhappy and prepared to come to London to make their views known, and are fed up with London being full of pro-Palestinian protests, all this kind of stuff.
Sure.
And there's also recently been some pro-Israel protests as well. So I think people are feeling the need to fight back. I still think, you were saying people are unhappy, but they kind of is
a directionless. It feels a little bit that way.
But to me, it's pretty obvious what the problem is. The country is stagnated.
Sure.
Our culture is being undermined. Our civilization is being questioned. Even down to basic biology.
Correct. Yeah.
Basic history.
Yeah.
Is Britain a great country or not? Are men, women and women? All these basic things are being questioned. People are like, what on earth is going on? I was just happily living my life, and I thought everything was fine. And now suddenly I realised that the nut jobs have taken over. And that's how people feel about what is happening. And I think it's interesting that a lot of business figures are now becoming more worried about what's happening in Britain.
Yeah.
But these were the people who did not get involved in politics for years and years and years and just thought they didn't have to worry. But because they weren't getting involved, the leftist radicals were getting involved. Because the leftist radicals are very determined. And, we can see the appalling events in America of Charlie Kirk's murder, just how extreme these people are. And, I think what is happening is in Britain as well is the other side of the argument are beginning to understand that and beginning to understand what the threat is.
We saw this one march, but we've seen many, many more marches for Palestine. Tell me about those marches and also tell me about your views on the Israel-Hamas war.
I don't think that these people should be able to disrupt central London.
Really?
In the way that they have. I'm in favour of peaceful demonstrations, but sure. I think there's been too much allowing disruption.
Yeah.
And also the Just Stop Oil crew as well.
Of course.
Yeah. I think there should be nothing that is inciting racial hatred, which we have seen elements of.
Very much
in
so.
The pro-Hamas marches. And as for the Israel, I'm a big supporter of Israel. I think the situation in Israel, there is clearly a lot of manipulation and fake stuff that is being put out in the media about what Israel's doing, and I think that's very wrong.
Very much so. It's one of the best conducted PR propaganda operations I've ever seen.
I'd like to understand exactly where it's coming from, who's funding it, how they operate, because these people are dangerous.
Can you tell me about the Islamist infiltration of the UK, and does it involve, how involved is the Muslim Brotherhood in this?
I'm not a sort of expert on these organisations and how they've infiltrated the UK. I think there is clearly some evidence that they have successfully infiltrated parts of the British system.
Sure.
There are organisations that are banned in the Arab states that are allowed in Britain,
The Muslim
and it's
Brotherhood,
become a
obviously.
hotbed of these types of activities. I think there's also the political aspect for the Labour Party of being challenged by the Islamic separatists. So Labour MPs are, and this is particularly true of people like Jess Phillips, are clearly appeasing Islamists as a way of trying to hold on to their seats. And this is, you can see with the Corbyn party and the direction that they're being pulled. So that is another factor. I think though that we shouldn't despair, and that the Islamists can be taken on.
My final question, what's your most based opinion, Liz?
Oh my God, I'm not going to say it on here. I mean, what I had 14 years of being an MP, where 12 of those years I was under collective responsibility. And 10 of those years I was under collective responsibility. I think I was actually 10 years as a minister. I got the number wrong earlier. It's hard to remember some of these things sometimes. But the point is that I had to stick to the government line the whole time in public. And that sort of restrains what you can think or say. But yes, I am somebody that thinks about things from first principles. I think very freely. And I think that where we are now compared to where we were in 2010, just the extreme nature of the opposition we're facing, we have to get a lot tougher. We have to get a lot tougher. And there are too many people on the right hand, the right wing, who kind of say, well, we have to find a centre ground. We have to, debate these people. Like, no, these people want to destroy our country. That's what we are. That's what we're facing. So I've become more, I think previously I thought we could win within the system. Now I think we've got to change the system. That's what fundamentally has changed about my belief. So maybe that's the most base thing, I think.
Liz Truss, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.